Naomi Ishisaka, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Well, so you recently attended, along with many others, the National Association of Black Journalists and Hispanic Journalists Convention that was held in Las Vegas recently. And you also wrote about this in a column about a workshop that you attended, and I take it many others did as well. And the issue really was media privilege and white victims, particularly dealing with those that go people that go missing. Now we know in this state we been a little progressive in establishing an alert system for indigenous women, but yet this issue of when people of color go missing compared to white people go missing is still an issue. So tell us what you found in that workshop.
Yeah, I mean it's a huge issue. I think people in recent years have become more familiar with the missing murdered Indigenous women and people movement that really came to the fore in the last few years, and I think that really drew a lot of attention to the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women, which I wrote about a few months ago as well. But I think the issue of how other people of color are reported or not reported on when they go missing is one that's been persisting for many decades, and that's really what the focus of this session was on. And one of the things that they talked a lot about was who's perceived as being vulnerable and in danger, right? And so what they said was that because so often when Black parents or families are reporting that their children are missing or some of their family members are missing, um, frequently they're told, oh, that person's just a runaway, or that's not really a problem, everything's fine. Then maybe they just like walked away for a second. They don't take it as seriously as it's taken if it's a white child or a white family member. And so because of that, it's less likely that a police report will be taken. It's less likely that there'll be sort of a push to find the person. And what happens is that it's then it's much less likely that the person will be found, and the cases will be followed up on. So that's really the crux of the issue, and part of it has to do with this sense of who's vulnerable and who's somebody that we need to protect.
Yeah, you know what's interesting to me is it almost is kind of a compounding issue, and the fact that the authorities don't take these missing women as serious, the press doesn't pick up on it, and I
Exactly.
think the public would be stunned to understand the amount of indigenous and women of color that go missing versus white women. But white women disproportionately get all the notoriety. And then people turn around and say, yeah, see, they favor white women. I think it's it that no one picks up on this for some reason. I mean, well, I obviously know the reason, but I think that we need to keep this in the forefront of everything because I still remember there's one black comedian who had this thing about white women being found lost in all the press, and then he looked at some black woman in the audience, go like, "No one's going to be looking for you." I mean, and I'm thinking like everybody laughs, and I go like, "But that's so true."
Yeah.
And
I mean,
and the side effect of that is actually terrifying in the sense that people that would seek to cause harm to people of color, women in particular, know this. They know that it's much less likely that attention is going to be paid when it's a woman of color or a Black woman, Indigenous woman, and so they know that those are victims that are in their minds safer to target, and that's a terrifying thing. It's a terrible thing. It's just compounding oppression upon oppression.
And they can get away with it. That's the thing that is really scary more than anything else. Knowing that because of this, they have a good chance of not being caught, or if they
Yes.
ever do, it'll take a long time. Now, at this convention too, in this workshop, and by the way, this was also put on by the founders of the Black and Missing Foundation. It's been around for about 14 years now, and it was co-founded and by I think a mother, and was it a sister as well that were
Yeah, they're
involved in this?
sisters-in-law. Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah. So tell
And
me about them.
they really came into this work because one of them had realized that someone that had gone missing in her hometown wasn't getting at all the kind of attention that another person who was white was getting. And so she had called, they had called media and all different, and there was just no interest at all. They were persistent, they pressed and pressed, but the media's interest was just very, very small compared to a white woman who had gone missing. And so they started to see this disparity, and that's really what propelled them into this work. So it's really driven by their own personal experience of seeing this play out in real life.
Right. Right.
Well, how do you, as a journalist, how do you advocate for these stories? I mean, it's got to be a push because, these aren't easy stories to tell. They people feel like, well, that's not that of interest, but I think it is. I mean, I know it is, but how do you advocate for this as being a journalist?
Yeah, I mean, I think it gets back to kind of our foundation as journalists, which is, sharing people's stories with dignity and agency, and treating people as if their lives matter. And I think a lot of times we know in the media there's sort of a hierarchy, and I think that we need, as journalists of color, we have an opportunity to really upend that hierarchy and say, you know what, our communities, our relatives, our family members, our community members matter just as much as everyone else's does. And I was reminded from that workshop, the reporter who was the moderating the conversation, she said that she goes back to her newsrooms and is just persistent, relentless. She just keeps telling the news directors, this is what we should be covering, this is why, and just every single day just being absolutely relentless about it until they start taking up the cases of people of color as much as they do white people. And she just has made it her mission. And I think it speaks to the value and importance of having people of color in our newsrooms who really see that person as being someone that could be in their family, but if you don't see other people as someone in your community, in your family, then it's easy to be like, oh, well, we're not really interested in those people, which is why having a diverse media landscape is so critical.
Well, you're part of the management team at the Seattle Times. You're an assistant managing editor, covering diversity, inclusion, staff development. What kind of challenge do you run into, even though you're part of the leadership team?
Yeah, I mean, I think honestly, I think the Seattle Times has done a really good job of delving deeply into these issues. There was a huge project that we did a few years ago, and I'm going to be forgetting the name of it, but it was a huge project focused on missing and merged Indigenous people and women. Beautifully done project that a team of people did before I got there. I've been writing about this persistently. Other staff have as well. I think where we run into problems is that if there is no official report of a person going missing, because police might have said, oh, well, that person's just a runaway, it's not a big deal, then it's hard for that information to come filter up to us, so we really need to hear from the public directly, and not always rely on the police as a source of this kind of information, and have the families and community members say, this is what's going on with me. We want to hear those stories, we want to know what's going on in the community. And I think sometimes the community has seen so long that media hasn't paid attention, that they're kind of like, well, they're not going to care, and I guess I would love to share with your audience that, we do care, we care a lot. And so they can reach out to me, they can reach out to any of the other editors. Do we get it right 100% of the time? No, we don't. But I think that, once we let the community know that this is something that we do care a lot about and we do want to cover, and so do the other media organizations, find reporters that you see on TV or the radio or in print, and see like who's covering these stories well, and reach out to those folks. And I think that'll make a big difference.
It's a challenge. I know that during my time in the business full time, that getting people to talk at times could be difficult, mainly because I think sometimes there's a cultural issue of not wanting to open up, but also trust.
Yes.
And that you have to build trust.
Yes.
And media in the past, being mainly white, hasn't really given those people in communities of color very much of a reason to be trustworthy or trustful. So
that's absolutely right.
Yeah.
That's absolutely right. And I think sometimes people are like, well, how come you didn't tell us? It's like, well, where have you been for, my entire life? You've never been in my community. So why would I trust that I would be, beneficial to reach out to you?
I mean, there's no relationships built. So,
right.
So when something happens, everybody's all in, right? And they're talking to everybody, and then it dissipates. And so there's no relationships built. I mean, even now, what's most distressing to me is like all that we've been through with the Black Lives Matters movement, right? It's now been reduced to a meme, right? Yeah, Antifa, BLM, this, and they just throw the terms out with no meaning anymore. And that's really distressing to me because have we, where's the fire? Because no one's carrying, in the communities, we're carrying that load. But for our stories to be told, the media is just not doing it. And I kind of understand where they're at. They have assignments, they have to do this, they have to do their coverage. But I just wish we were covering it deeper and more.
No, that's right. And I think that, one of the things that we've learned the past couple of years is that, the kind of change that we talk about in terms of racial justice and equity, those arcs are very, very hard to bend. There was all this enthusiasm, all this energy in 2020. But, time passes and things don't magically change the way people hope they would. And so people start to say, well, that was a wasted effort, or that wasn't worth our time, or we're not willing to sacrifice. And I think that that's, everything just sort of falls back to the routine, what people are used to, versus the dramatic change that I think a lot of people were talking about in 2020.
Well, I think that, COVID has definitely had an impact as well.
Absolutely.
Let's face it, because we had to have to hide away from people, and people are still working from home. As we talk to you, you're home. So that has changed the dynamic of being around people all the time and covering these issues. But I think one other thing that has come out, and Matt has talked about this a lot, is kind of this younger generation of people of color that really they do not trust mainstream media as much as somebody that is right wing. And so that has become sometimes a real issue in trying to gain trust in the communities. Have you run into that a lot?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I think there's so much that we need to do, especially in local journalism, to really help people understand the role that journalism in the public service and the public interest plays. I think we have more information sources than ever. We have more ways to get information than ever. They have more people producing information than ever. But I think there's some work that we need to do to really help people understand how to vet the information that they're receiving.
Exactly. Yeah.
How to use and apply a critical thinking to understand like what's motivating the person who's providing this information to me. I think there's a lot of media literacy work that is going to be really necessary going forward, because, and I'm not saying that, the only way to get reliable information is through the mainstream media. There's certainly, lots of places out there that have excellent investigative journalism and all kinds of other media sources that are wonderful, that are outside the mainstream media. But I think whatever the source is, whether it's the New York Times or, a community news organization, we should be applying the same level of skepticism, critical thinking, and really thinking, okay, what's the agenda of the person behind, who have they talked to? Have they actually asked a lot of questions from a lot of different sources? All the things that we think about as journalists, I think, people kind of wave their hands and say, oh, well, that's just, that it's all just BS, basically. Yeah. But the reality is that there are different levels to it, right? Like there's certain levels of credibility that I think, we've earned at the Seattle Times, others have earned as well, that makes the things that we write and report more trustworthy. But that said, there's a lot of people who don't trust the media at all. And I also understand where they're coming from and why that is.
Yeah. But, I want to change subject a little bit, because your column this morning was about the Sound Transit Station in the Chinatown International District, which is something near and dear to my heart. And that fight is ongoing. Do you think, because I'm so close to the Asian community, but do you think white people give a shit about this? Really, because, you hear this from Ballard and West Seattle, well, we want our this and this, but they're not as at risk as Chinatown is. I mean, this is our cultural heritage.
Yeah.
Do you think white people give a shit?
I I mean, I think the answer is probably not really. And I think that's been true for, this from decades and decades. I mean, this has been a generations long battle to, protect the international district from all sorts of threats. And I think that this is just sort of the latest incarnation of that. But, it's always been sort of almost a, you know, Fendi, I kind of think of it as like a castle, it's like there's like all these like things that keep coming at it from all these different sides, and then folks are just in the castle like desperately just trying to protect it from all these sort of encroachments. And I think it's been really, really hard because a lot of people don't see why it matters. They don't see why it's valuable. They don't see why this little part of Seattle needs and deserves protection. And I think that it's unfortunate because people like to go to the international district, Chinatown International District, and eat food or go to a shop or something like that, but they don't really understand that this is a community where people live. It's a community where people work. It's a community where people get to remember. I don't know if you read Ron Chu's book about the international district, but it was just a beautiful story about the generations, his father, his father's father, like all these people who you learn who you are and how to be in the world because you've grown up there. You've seen your family, work and own businesses and thrive there.
It's history. It's history. It's history.
Yeah,
it's an important history. I mean,
absolutely.
And that's the thing that becomes mind-boggling. That's not to say that other neighborhoods in Seattle don't have that history, but I'd say for the CID, the difference in the history, particularly with having a community that has been, ostracized and outlawed, and then sent to camps,
incarcerated,
right? All this stuff, and yet they continue to still fight to exist.
Yeah,
and so it is a real different thing to get people to understand. By the way, Matt, I that would be a good name for a podcast. Do white people give a shit? I don't know. Well, I was just thinking. It's
interesting. I think a lot of what happens to the CID is through government. The city government does things that just inadvertently mess that district up. I mean, like, one example was we need to bring everything up to fire code. Well, people can't afford to do that, but the city doesn't give them assistance. They say, no, we got to shut you down. And then all these people lose housing. And then developers come in and say, well, we'll help you. And then immediately gentrification starts because the property ownership then flows out. My time with the mayor, when I was working for the mayor, I mean, I didn't really think that a lot of attention was paid to the CID either. And in fact, what pissed me off the most is that the city, when they made their statement about it, sort of punted on the CID. Well, we need further study. Clearly, it's just you need to take a stand.
Yeah. Well, I think you got to look. All you have to do is look at what has happened to the Central District.
Oh, yeah. When you have white people in restaurants go like, why are there black people here? Right. Things have changed, right?
Yeah. Again, it's that historic knowledge or lack thereof that is, a big problem.
Naomi, getting back to your original question though about this is, whenever I write about the Central area or the International District and other culturally specific communities, the response I always get is, well, those communities have always shifted. It used to be this or it used to be that, and so why are you so uptight about it now? Why do you care about it now? And I think that's easy to say when everything is yours, right?
Yes,
exactly. You can live anywhere, you can go anywhere. No one's going to ask you, what are you doing here? Why are you here? How long have you been here? Do you speak English? Like all the things that communities of color get asked. Or even like you said in the Central District, like being asked, I had a friend tell me about being asked in the Central District, whether or not she needed directions. Her family lived there for generations. Like, no, I'm fine. What about you? But it's just this assumption of like where you belong and where you don't belong. And so that's why these cultural specific communities matter so much to us.
Again, and that's a good point about, when they bring up, well, why are you bringing this up again, and why are you bringing up now? Well, it's because it's sort of like when somebody says they're not racist. If you got to ask that question, then there's something really wrong, I think. But I want to go back to your job and what you do, and how has this been in the last couple of years, particularly with after George Floyd, the impact of the protests here in Seattle. Uh, did you feel more of a need to, I guess, lead as far as with the times on this issue, or how did it affect what you did or what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The summer of 2020 was just a whirlwind. I wasn't in my role that I'm in now then, but it was a whirlwind for everyone. I mean, it was just incredibly hard for our journalists that were on the street covering these things, caught between oftentimes, protesters on one side, police on the other. It's really, really difficult situation for everyone. But, I'm really proud of the fact that, and I've told this to many people, I'm really proud of the fact that the summer of 2020 was not when the Seattle Times suddenly realized that race and racial equity was a priority or something that we should care about. It's been a long, long, long time effort that the newsroom as a whole, but specifically the leadership team, had been focused on. And one of the things I'm really proud of is that, when they hired me into this role in the leadership team, they were very clear, like, this is not you're not the magic unicorn that's going to come in and make everything better. And it's very clear that this is a entire, newsroom effort and project that we all are committed to working on. The leadership that our executive editor, our managing editor, are two incredible women with decades and decades of experience in this work, and know from their own experience and from being in this work how critical these types of shifts and making sure that our newsroom represents our community is to the quality of our journalism and the accuracy of our journalism. That's foundational to our work. And that long predated me. And I'm really proud of that, because I think a lot of newsrooms did say, ooh, wow, look at what's going on. Let's hire a diversity person. Let's have the diversity person fix diversity. Well, it doesn't work that way. It's, as we all know, like, these are long, long changes that take many, many years to just, steer to turn the battleship. And that's kind of what I see it as. It's like turning a battleship. It's going to take time. It takes lots of effort, lots of people, everyone being on board. And it's a slow process.
Yeah, I don't see us ever fixing this. I mean, we can cover stories and bring things to light, but it's not until, people of all races get their shit together that we're going to be able to make some progress. But fixing it, maybe here and there. But I think it's a tremendous challenge to be covering race. Yeah. And because it's a hard thing to do. It's an emotional thing to do. But yet it is clearly needed, but yet we're so afraid of it yet. That's the thing that boggles my mind.
I think white people are afraid of it. I mean, I was at a workshop one time at the UW where I'm teaching, and it was about microaggressions. And someone asked us, like, why do people of color always talk about race? And I'm thinking, like, because that's our life. Mm-hmm. I mean, code switching is our life. Mm-hmm. That's why it's interesting for us in this podcast, is that we centered around people of color. So
yeah,
one of the things I wanted to ask you is, since you have the long view of stuff, you cover the daily stuff, but you also look at what's going on. What are the big topics that you're looking at, that you're working on, that are affecting people of color in Seattle? I mean, what are the things that we should be looking out at? What's happening? I mean, what's going on that's really important?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my answer to this would be maybe unconventional, in the sense that I kind of look at things that are seen as things that affect everyone, and think about how they affect people of color specifically, or marginalized communities specifically. So, for example, I think, how we think about housing and wealth inequality, right? That's something that everyone thinks about, everyone cares about. But I think that we have a real obligation and responsibility to look specifically at how our incredible wealth inequality in the city has pushed people of color out of it and made it so that people can no longer afford to live here. And that's going to change the entire fabric of our city in ways that I don't think we really grappled with and really have understood the generations long impact of. So for example, if you have, you know, a neighborhood like this, the central area where, you know, houses are upwards of $1 million, you know, what is that going to mean for the ability for, you know, homeowners who've lived here for generations to stay there, right? We know the answer to that, but I think that we haven't really grappled with what does that mean for our city when only the uber rich can live here? And what does that mean for our demographics? What does it mean for the kind of city that I grew up in and want to live in? You know, so I think about things like that as things that are specifically about race and racial equity. I think about climate change as it affects communities of color. I think people have sort of always thought, well, that's, you know, that's something that white people care about. Like, no, we have to make climate change something that we care about, because we're the ones who are going to be hurt the first and the worst. And I wrote a column about this last summer, and people like, oh, now you're saying the air is racist too. And I'm like, no, but the world that we've created that has put, you know, the majority of people of color in harm's way when it comes to pollution, when it comes to air quality, comes to heat, like all those things are going to is going to cause even more hardship for our communities, right? And so I think, you know, rich people are always going to be able to find a way to compensate for these kinds of, you know, external harms, right? But it's going to be our communities that are really going to be left in you know, in the sights of these types of shifts in a way that I don't think we've fully begun to talk about.
Well, I mean, we look at COVID and how it impacted
Yeah,
our
in
communities of
COVID,
color.
absolutely.
Look at water and
Water,
healthcare.
yes,
Look at
yes,
how cities like Flint, Michigan, still dealing with the water there and the tainted water that,
yeah,
you know, has
absolutely.
decimated a community. So in many ways, you're again, and I think it rolls back to what Matt was saying in bringing up the issue of what's happening in the Chinatown International District. Of what happens if that community goes away, becomes
Mhm,
like the Central District, you
mhm.
know? So
Yeah,
then what is Seattle?
right.
Yeah.
What is
That that
Seattle then?
that
You
has an
know,
indigenous, you know, base to
right.
it that we only occasionally bring up. And you know, now it's cool to always acknowledge these things at events, but do we really know the history of
Yes,
of the people that
exactly.
come
Yeah,
here, that were here first, and we don't really deal with their issues as much. So it's that's tough. That's really tough. But I'm glad that that's what you see, because
Yeah,
you know
yeah.
that, and that's a challenging job to have, to be able to continue to do that. And but it's also an important job, so you know, kudos to
Because
you.
yeah, because the readership of Seattle Times is basically white, and so it's good for them because unless they know the issues, it's hard for them to care because their privilege protects them. They
Yeah.
don't have to think about that. They don't have to think about displacement in the central area,
yeah,
right? They can just get their apartments or houses and they're fine. And this, they have a new PCC there, right? I mean,
Yeah.
a Whole Foods, and they don't care. They don't because they don't have to.
right.
But we also still have a real challenge when it comes to journalism, and the fact that it is teetering. You know, it's kind of like our democracy right now,
Hmm.
and is that you know, the business itself is you know, it's facing huge financial challenge, and that's why we have so many different things going on. But without it, you know, that's not a good thing, particularly with
Absolutely.
misinformation these days and all of that. So that is being able to have a Seattle Times around, whatever you think about it and whatever you think of the coverage, it's critical, because without it, again, it's just another
Yeah,
knock on democracy and taking it out. But
I
yeah,
know
And I don't
people.
think people really understand. I don't really think people understand the impact of
no.
losing our daily newspapers and what that means to a community.
No,
Well,
they don't.
they don't. I think we, you know, again, and we've talked about this numerous times, the whole desensitization that we have, I think, brought about by misinformation. and by politicians that have taken this road of like, let's lie about everything because we can, and nobody's going to do a thing about it. So that's a sad thing. Okay, I'm depressing myself. So here we go. All right.
Well, I really think people should support the Seattle Times or any of the local nonprofit media or the for-profit that's doing a good job, because they just don't get it. I mean, it's actually cheap to subscribe to the Seattle Times, but people say, "Well, why?" And I like, you'll know why if it's ever gone.
There you go.
I mean,
Yeah.
I may not agree with everything that is written in there, but you need to have that. It's an institution. It's part of what keeps our city solid.
And also, like, what I always tell people about this is who stands to benefit most if there's no watchdog reporting.
Exactly.
Right? Who's going to be the happiest about that? And are the people that are happiest about that happy because it's they're going to benefit you, or are they happy because it's going to benefit them? Right.
Them, of course.
Right.
And
I think people don't realize, like, you might not like everything you see, but there's a reason why, so many so many government officials, so many business officials know that there's someone keeping an eye out for what they're doing. That makes a big difference into what they think that they can and cannot get away with. I've done some research on this for various reasons, and there's all this data that shows in places that have lost their newspapers or news organizations, there's less government accountability, there's less people that run for office, there's less interest in elections and voting. I mean, those things are very bad for all of us.
Yeah. Coming back to the CID, one thing that is really a silver lining for me is, and you alluded to it in your column, was it's one of the few times multi-generational groups are coming together for a change, and they're not canceling each other.
Yeah.
And I think there's a real opportunity here to see what real people power can be if we band together. And I hope people keep telling this story.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so important. And I really, I've written about this before, but I really grew up in that CID world where, it was multi-generational. Everyone was sort of banding together to fight the kingdom and other projects. And when I was growing up, that was such a hotbed of advocacy and activism to protect something that people thought was under threat and very valuable. And so, I think that's what I wrote about in this column is like, we're seeing that happen again now, and it's for a difficult reason for sure, but to see that happening now, it's like, that'll help when the next thing comes along or the next threat comes along, right, in the communities, being able to advocate for itself.
Naomi Ishisaka, thank you so much for joining us. Seattle Times Assistant Managing Editor for Diversity, Inclusion, and Staff Development. Read her column on race, culture, equity, social justice, and make sure that the Seattle Times continues to exist. Thanks, Naomi, for your time.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
I hope you come back, often, because we've got a lot to talk about.
Yeah, that was really fun. Thank you so much.
All right. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.